All right. So good morning, everybody. This is class number 5. So we'll do a little brief overview of the last couple weeks like we do every week, and then we will keep plugging forward in the 19th century with two other intellectual movements that I think will be a lot of fun. So we started off really 1700s in mostly Germany, but similar classes could be given of the Jewish community in France and England. These are countries in Western Europe that were undergoing two phenomena at the same time. One was the general Enlightenment, ideas that contradict sort of strict traditional religion, ideas of, say, where humans come from, age of the earth, the historicity or lack thereof of the Bible, all of that field that we've talked about before. And then for Jews, the additional challenge of political equality, emancipation, the so-called Jewish question, aka who are Jews? How do we integrate them into society? Do Jews want to be integrated into society? Any and all of those questions. The first major thinker who all later Jewish thinkers are sort of in his shadows is Moses Mendelssohn, which is why we spent a whole class talking about Mendelssohn. And I think I made this remark in the first class on many of Mendelssohn's honorings after he died, the phrase from Moses to Moses to Moses, there was none like Moses. And that, of course, refers to one Moses of the Bible, Moshe Rabbeinu. The second is Moses Maimonides, perhaps the greatest Jewish both philosopher and legal scholar to ever live. And then finally, Moses Mendelssohn in the 18th century. And so Mendelssohn, if you remember, put forth a path for Jewish modernity that allowed Judaism to shift from this vague intersection of community norms and laws and ideas and cultures and practices that it was in the Middle Ages to viewing Judaism as much more of a religion that could be neatly separated from other areas of life. And there's a lot to say about that. We talked about that a bunch. And then we sort of traced the evolution of this idea. We paused for a moment to talk about the Hasidic Jewish community that was undergoing a parallel phenomenon in Eastern Europe. But the main show is right now happening in Germany. And last week we saw Abraham Geiger and the Reform movement and all of what Geiger was trying to do, which again, Abraham Geiger and, of course, early Reform movement, both in Germany and then eventually America, was addressing these two challenges head on. Challenge number one, how do you deal with a crash between Judaism and modernity? You choose modernity and you try to shape Judaism into fitting modernity. So it turns out that if you read a lot of Immanuel Kant, it might not seem so logical and morally rational to wake up every single morning and bind phylacteries or tefillin onto your arm and head. So Abraham Geiger says, well, that's not really the important part of Judaism. The important part of Judaism is the philosophic and religious ideas behind the practice, aka ethical monotheism. And so you can discard the sort of external ritual practice as long as you keep the innate religious form. Now, this was Abraham Geiger's entire project of Reform Judaism, and we talked about this a lot last week. It is obviously influenced by the Protestant type of religiosity that was in the air, this sort of very rationalized ethical Protestantism. Now, as we saw last week, Geiger would defend himself, and he did defend himself by saying, yes, but that was from Judaism first. And so one of the interesting things that we get, and I think I mentioned this last week, but I'll probably mention this every single week, any Jewish thinker in the 17, 18, and 1900s who tried to lay out a platform for what Judaism should become was not making the argument necessarily, we need to completely change Judaism. They were making the argument there is some ideal form of Judaism in history, and that's been lost because of exile and diaspora, right? That ends up being a major theme of Jewish thought, is the idea of exile and diaspora and what is lost of a people if it's no longer in control of its own land. We'll talk about that, obviously, a lot more when we address Zionism. But Geiger was making the argument, we need to return to what Judaism was supposed to be. And that was a religious set of ideas and values that focus on one God, the imperatives that come from believing all humans are created in the image of God. But what Geiger notably left out, of course, and this is going to be the subject of today's class, is any adherence to halakha or Jewish law. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But the second thing that Geiger was talking about, because again, all modern Jewish thought is based off of two problems at the same time. How do you deal with religion coming into modernity, and how do you achieve political emancipation in modernity? The sort of second part of Geiger's project was to say, if Jews stop doing all of our, I'll put this very crudely, if Jews stop doing all the things that weird out the rest of German society, that's going to allow a quicker process for us to become emancipated, right? No longer will Jews be this strange people doing their own strange set of rituals, but Judaism will look like just another branch of Christianity, albeit, yes, with slightly different prayers. And yes, of course, Jews don't talk much about Jesus, but for Geiger, this was all part of the project of gaining emancipation. So that was all last week. So today we are going to start off also in the 19th century, also in Germany. And this is what I'm going to call the anti-antinomians. I know that's quite a mouthful. Yes, if anybody here is mathematically inclined, they can probably just say you should have called it nomians. But one of the interesting, so nomian and comes from nomos, which is Greek for law. So antinomian means anti-law, right? And that we can classify Abraham Geiger's worldview as antinomian. The reason why I call this anti-antinomian and not, pronomian is there was a big debate, and this is something that our main thinker for today, Samson Raphael Hirsch, is going to take up, where Jewish thinkers were upset that people were conflating Jewish law, aka halacha, with any other form of law. And as Hirsch is going to argue, halacha has nothing to do with just another legal system. And if you consider halacha just another legal system, you've already made your first error. So even to say that Jews have their own nomos, borrowing from the Greek language of law, right? The French have their own nomos, the English have their own nomos, Americans, we have our own nomos. So if you say, yes, Jews just have their own nomos, according to Hirsch, you are making a fundamental error because, as he's going to argue, halacha, or the Jewish way of life, is fundamentally distinct from other forms of law. And one of the big points, the sticking points between Hirsch and Geiger, and we'll go into this a little bit more today, is general forms of law, right? Greek law, or hopefully American law, has some sort of, set rationale or philosophical underpinning, right? So if you're studying to become a lawyer in America, you're probably studying both the history of the law, but also that's under an assumption that these laws make sense, right? If it turns out that these laws don't make sense for what we're trying to do, hopefully there's some process in the country. I mean, there is fundamentally, but one would expect people in charge of the law to get together and figure out, okay, how do we change these laws? Because if the only point of a law is to benefit the public good or to help people reach their full potential, that law becomes malleable. Hirsch is going to argue that Jewish law fundamentally is immutable and immalleable, right? So he would have been upset with me calling him an anti-antinomian. So just to go through a little bit of the history, Orthodox Judaism, this is always an interesting sticking point because I've heard two opposite views by people that talk about Orthodox Judaism just by passing. One such view goes as follows. I'll present both views in their strongest form, and then obviously I'll argue that both are incorrect without each other, right? So one person might tell you, well, throughout Jewish history, everybody was just Orthodox, because there was no reform or conservative or secular. And so orthodoxy is just, natural traditional Judaism, right? You go to any medieval Jewish community and you would have said, oh, this is just an Orthodox Jewish community, right? That is one historic standpoint on Orthodox Judaism. A second person will tell you, no, nothing like orthodoxy ever arose until there was people that would have classified themselves as non-Orthodox. Again, Orthodox meaning somebody with a straight dogma or set dogma. And so orthodoxy as a historical phenomena was actually a reaction to both Reform and Conservative Judaism. As we'll see, both of these views are correct in some way, right? They're both wrong and incomplete without the other one. But just to talk a little bit about this phenomenon of Orthodox Judaism, one more fun tidbit before talking about the history. Originally, orthodoxy was actually somewhat of a demeaning term. Orthodoxy arose by actually non-Orthodox or Reformed Jewish thinkers referring to Jews who were holding steadfast to religious tradition and dogma as orthodox, right? Jews don't really have a dox, right? Jews don't really have a dogma. And so a lot of Reformed Jews, starting in Germany, referred to Jews who were unwilling to evolve their religious outlook in the face of what at least many Reformed Jews consider to be obvious proof that Jews had to reconsider their Reform outlook. Oh, those are just the Orthodox. Interestingly enough, a similar history can be said about the Haredim, right? The Haredim in Israel, oftentimes translated as ultra-Orthodox. Haredi in Hebrew literally means trembling, right? Somebody who trembles. And so this was actually, again, a negative epithet by mainly secular Israelis at the beginning of the state, saying, oh, these people are, they're so religious, they're shaking, right? They're trembling, right? It's sort of an insult. But then the Haredi population sort of happily wore that on their sleeve. And there's a verse in Isaiah, I believe, about, those who tremble before God, right? People who have such strong belief that they're trembling in the face of God. So, right, even with these names, there's sort of interesting history behind it. But Orthodox Judaism really starts out in Hungary, right? So far away from, or somewhat far away from Germany, with a rabbi named Moshe Schreiber, better known as the Khatam Sofer. And the Khatam Sofer, and Hungary was a different political situation. Jews were not trying to fight for necessarily political emancipation in Hungary in the 1800s, but the Khatam Sofer is going to put forth a platform that's going to forever change what we would now consider to be ultra-Orthodox Judaism. And he had this great pun, right? This pun requires a little bit of Jewish Halakhic knowledge. There is a category of food in Halacha called Chadash, right? For those who are familiar with Hebrew, Chadash, also, right, from the word Chodesh, right? Chadash means something that's new, right? So there's a line in the Talmud that says, Chadash is forbidden by the Torah. Chadash asar min haTorah, right? The Khatam Sofer took this as a pun. Instead of Chadash, the type of food that's unkosher, he used this as a pun to say anything that's new, any innovation, be it religious, philosophical, cultural, right, political, that is forbidden by the Torah. And this became sort of the moniker of what would eventually become ultra-Orthodox Judaism. Is this a new idea? Is this a new thing? Did this thing exist 200 years ago? If the answer is no, we don't want it, right? Plenty of people will ask me, why do you never see an ultra-Orthodox Jew wearing, say, jeans, right? Levi's jeans, right? And it's because of the Khatam Sofer, right? Did jeans exist 200 years ago? No, we're not going to wear jeans, right? And that, of course, goes to secular music and secular media and movies, all the way to, obviously, new ways of practicing and viewing religious Judaism. So this was the project in Central and Eastern Europe by the nascent ultra-Orthodox community of essentially reacting to the Haskalah by saying, full-throated no thank you, right? We don't want this. We don't want this religiously, right? That's sort of obvious, right? So if Darwin's coming up with new theories about the origin of man and the Bible scholars are coming up with new theories about how the Bible came to be compiled, right? Obviously, the Khatam Sofer would say no thank you. But interestingly enough, also in the project of political emancipation, the ultra-Orthodox community mostly said no thank you. Why? Because, again, if we remember back from class 1, in the pre-modern period, Jewish communities were fully self-autonomous, right? Obviously, they didn't have any political power, but Jewish communities in Europe before emancipation and before the birth of, nationalism and liberalism and all these movements of the late 17 and early 1800s, Jewish communities were left alone and they can live out their full life by themselves. And so the example that I always give, if my horse accidentally hits Fred's horse, I don't know, leaving the shop for the day, and I was in any Jewish community, we're going to the rabbis, and the rabbis are going to adjudicate the case just the same as if I accidentally, I don't know, made my kitchen not kosher and I'm trying to figure out how do I make this kosher again. And so an ultra-Orthodox community is not going to be happy with this synthetic split of Judaism, the religion, from, say, France or Hungary or Germany, the political entity with its own set of laws. This is still the case, by the way, right? This is one of the big reasons, just to take a step back, that the ultra-Orthodox community today is so loath to integrate within Israeli society. It's still the case. If you were to go to Mea Sharim or Bnei Barak or Beit Shemesh, right, some of the heavily populated ultra-Orthodox communities, and you were to get into a business dispute, 9 times out of 10, you're not going to the secular Israeli courts. You're going to a Beit Din, right? You're going to a religious court, and the rabbis are not opening up the history of Israeli law and Israeli Supreme Court rulings to figure out, who wins this court case. They're using the Talmud. The same is the case in Jewish communities in New York, right? Ultra-Orthodox and Hasidic communities in New York. Again, it's a little bit more complicated, but oftentimes legal disputes that we would normally think of as, oh, those are civic disputes, not legal disputes, the Orthodox community says, well, this is a modern arbitrary distinction between the religious and the civil. We're just going to go to the rabbis, right? Obviously, this gets messy, right? And some of the most messy situations that happen in the Orthodox community, say in New York, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think an interesting one, are say, I don't know, me and Susan are both ultra-Orthodox Jews in New York, and we get into a fight, and I decide, okay, we're going to Beit Din. Let's say I don't like the ruling, and I say I'm going to sue you in the New York court system, right? All of a sudden, there's sort of a little bit of chaos there, because obviously whatever the rabbis say is not binding by any legal clause, right, in America. Nobody's asking what a bunch of rabbis say according to dictate American law. So you get all these really interesting edge cases of tension, oftentimes, of course, involving cases of divorce and custody of children, right? That can be a whole other class. But all of this, in some way, this philosophy goes back to Moshe Schreiber in Hungary, seeing what's happening as Jews are entering the Enlightenment and discussions of emancipation, and essentially saying a full-throated no thank you, right? He, of course, would affirm the idea that halakha is divine, immutable, and binding, but for a variety of reasons, and hopefully these reasons are mostly obvious by now, this was no longer an option in Germany, because it's one thing to have this philosophy if everybody's starting off, very traditional and very religious. It's another if you're in Germany and Jews by the tens of thousands are converting out of Judaism, right? As we talked about last week, there were many young Jews who became Christian, including some of Moses Mendelssohn's own children. Two, the Reform movement, which again started in the early 1800s, quickly became the largest movement of major cities in Germany. And so if you were in a place like Bonn or Hamburg or Berlin in Germany in the year, say, 1850, right, the default assumption is that you were now going to a Reform temple, right? Same thing for America, by the way, right? If you were in America in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and you said you were going to, services on Shabbat, the assumption would be you're going to a Reform synagogue/temple. And so in Germany, if you wanted to have a project defending orthodoxy, you couldn't just adapt this, well, anything new is forbidden by the Torah, because this is a community that's already integrated, right? It's one thing to tell a community that's never, say, turned on a radio before, or that's never gone to the theater before, don't start doing this thing. It's another to take a community that's been doing this for 20 years and say, actually, all these things that you do for fun and leisure, you're not allowed to do anymore. And so Samson Raphael Hirsch, who we're going to spend the bulk of the time today talking about, he came onto the scene with this radical project that he called Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the world. And again, for today, it almost seems like, okay, this is obvious. But this at its time was a huge innovation. And we'll read some of his primary sources in a second. But his essential message was, you actually don't need to choose between Judaism and modernity, right? This seemed like sort of a radical idea at the time, because you had the ultra-Orthodox saying you have to choose and you have to pick Judaism. And you had the Maskilim, right? And I'll include the Reform movement in that, saying, yes, you also need to choose and you need to adapt Judaism into what modernity looks like. And Hirsch is going to say, no, you don't have to do either. And we'll see that in a second. The other thing, the last thing by way of introduction of Hirsch is the most important thing that was at the center of all of his works, and he wrote, a number of works, he was very prolific, is that Jewish law needs to continue to be the bread and butter of Judaism, right? The biggest, right, which is why I started with anti-antinomianism. All of these other debates are sort of downstream of this one big debate. Do Jews need to keep following halakha and Jewish law, right? This is still, if you go to your average Reform synagogue and your average Orthodox synagogue, right, today, 250 years later, after all these initial debates, that's still going to be the biggest fundamental tension between these two movements is halakha central, fundamental, and binding to Judaism, right? And so let's, I'll come back to the other movement in a second, but so one of the things that Hirsch wrote and spoke about many times as he was sort of gaining his voice is he talked about the phenomenon of what he called reverse Moranos. It's a very interesting and obviously insulting term just to talk about what are Moranos. So Morano, one, is a derogatory term, so nobody uses that anymore unless they're talking about the historic phenomenon. Morano literally means a swine, but a Morano was a Jew who, during the Inquisition, remained Jewish inside, but outside pretended to be Christian in order to not have to flee Spain and Portugal. And so the Inquisition started referring to certain Jews as Moranos, right? They're swine, right? Because they are, pretending to be something that they're not, right? And there's a whole history of that. What's a reverse Morano? So Hirsch, he observed that in Germany in the mid 1800s, you had a lot of Jews that were doing the exact opposite. You had a lot of Jews who were outwardly telling everybody that they were Jewish, but inward, there actually wasn't much Jewishness there, right? In other words, what Hirsch was saying was the problem now isn't that we have to publicly pretend to be something else. The problem now is that internally, the vast majority of Jews sort of don't feel that much of a connection to Judaism, right? I guess nothing's really changed in 200 years because, some might say that's a big problem we're going to today. But Hirsch observed this phenomenon in a number of ways. So one, Hirsch is going to be the most vehement critic of Reform Judaism. Obviously, the ultra-Orthodox, they weren't even involved within the same ballpark of reform. So obviously the Khatam Sofer would have been against reform, but he was sort of against anything that, smelled of modernity. So there wasn't much overlap between the Khatam Sofer and reform. Hirsch actually went to college with Avraham Geiger. And actually the fun fact is that they actually studied Talmud together when they were in college. And they spent many years as actually close friends, and they would respond to each other's work until a breaking point where their friendship sort of shattered later on in life. We can maybe talk about that a little bit later. But again, this should say halacha, but Hirsch's main point is that the rejection of halacha and the spreading of reform is going to be sort of a death blow to Judaism. At the same time, he noted that for the Jews in Germany who were remaining adherents to halacha, there was just a general sort of zombie-like function to it, that, most Jews were sort of, going through the routine, but most Orthodox Jews or most traditional Jews in Germany in the early and mid 1800s, there wasn't much spirit to what they were undergoing, right? This is far from Eastern Europe that had already undergone the Hasidic movement, right? Again, the Hasidic movement also was trying to fix this, general malaise of traditionalism by injecting all these, things like song and dance and meditation and drinking into Judaism. But this movement had not, come into Germany at all. And so Hirsch was seeing, you have three types of Jews. You have Jews who are completely willing to assimilate and convert to Christianity. You have the majority of Jews who are trying to make radical reforms to Judaism. And then the Jews who are still adhering to halacha, they don't seem that into it, right? And so for Hirsch, this was a problem, right? He sort of looked around and, right, there was this general malaise. And so his project was, again, to reinvigorate this group. At the same time, there were all of these expectations on Jews. And again, if I sound like a broken record, it's because, there really were these 4 or 5 sticking points that are just, all debates of modern Jewish thought to hover around of if Jews want to get emancipated, they have to act like good Germans. And what is a good German but copying what mainstream German culture looks like? And so Hirsch is going to deal with this question of how do you continue a traditionalist outlook on Judaism and also put yourself in a situation where you might be able to be granted emancipation, right? I had mentioned this before. Many Jews convert as well. So I wanted to go and actually read a little bit of primary source here because this is, I think, where Hirsch is at his most interesting. So we'll read this and then we can discuss, and then there's a couple more slides after that. So Hirsch writes this set of essays called the 19 Letters. And the 19 Letters, it's not very long, and it sort of touches to the root of what Hirsch was trying to do. And so in the beginning, he defends the Halakhic tradition, but then he gets to where he's at his most unique, where he talks about emancipation. And the entire book, The 19 Letters, just by way of introduction, is a conversation between a young Jewish man who is making the argument that Judaism doesn't seem to hold much relevance, and a wise rabbi who's sort of answering this confused Jewish man, right? You can guess who Hirsch thought himself to be. So just to read a little bit from letter 16. He says, "You ask me for my opinion on the question which at present agitates so greatly the minds of men, emancipation, whether I consider it feasible and desirable according to the spirit of Judaism, our duty to strive to attain it," right? So this, again, could be, thought of as the defining question at the time. I don't know where there we go. Right? Is emancipation part of Judaism? Do you have to sacrifice Judaism to get emancipation? Right? Certainly, many of the reformers believe that you do need to change Judaism in order to achieve emancipation. And the ultra-Orthodox believe that you also need to shave out some of Judaism in order to get emancipation, which is why they were anti-emancipation, right? So before Hirsch, virtually everybody believed you had to choose, right? You have political modernity / emancipation and Judaism, and you can have, one and a half, right? So which one do you cut in half, right? Do you cut Judaism in half, or do you cut your political and social mobility / emancipation in half? And Hirsch is going to say neither, right? So here's what he says. He says, this the new conception of Judaism, which you have gained, dear Benjamin. Benjamin is this confused young man, has rendered you uncertain as to the reconcilability of Gentile citizenship with the eternal ideas of our faith. You have begun to doubt whether the acceptance of these new relations be in harmony with the spirit of Judaism, inasmuch as it approximates to a close union with that which is different and alien, and a severance of the ties which bind us to Israel. What? You doubt its desirability because through overmuch intimacy with the Gentiles, Israel's peculiar characteristics could easily be obliterated. I respect your scruples and will communicate to you with my own opinion. Let us first examine whether it be in harmony with the spirit of Judaism, right? So we all get the question. Now, he's going to do something fascinating here. He's going to give a fascinating lecture on a evolution within the Bible that I'm going to guess some people here are familiar with. If not, this is probably one of the most interesting passages in the Bible. And he's going to go all the way back to Jeremiah, right? So I'll give the historic background in 1 second, but he's going to introduce us and say, when Israel began its great wandering through the ages and nations, Jeremiah proclaimed the following as its duty, right? So who is Jeremiah and what is he talking about? Jeremiah was a Jewish Israelite prophet in the 6th century BCE. What happened in the 6th century BCE? The Babylonian Empire, led by Nebuchadnezzar, came into the land of Israel, destroyed Jerusalem to the ground, burned the temple, and exiled the Israelites / Jews to Babylonia, right? So if you've heard the psalm, on the rivers of Babylon, we sat and wept while we remember Jerusalem, right? That psalm was written during this time in Jewish history, and this was the first sort of pivotal political crisis of Jewish history, right? Israelite culture had evolved around Jerusalem and around a centralized temple and around the land of Israel, and all of a sudden that all comes crashing down, and Jews are all of a sudden kicked out into the land of Babylonia. And so what happens? A wise leader / prophet named Jeremiah arises and sends a famous letter to this community, and the letter says as follows: build houses and dwell therein, plant gardens and eat the fruits thereof, take wives unto yourselves, beget sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give your daughters in marriage, that they bear sons and daughters, that you may multiply there and diminish not, and seek the peace of the city whither I have exiled you, and pray for it to the Lord, for in its peace there will be unto you peace. So Jeremiah tells this crushed Jewish community that's now living in Babylonia, hey, you're there, keep on living life, right? Keep planting gardens, keep farming, make sure that your kids, have good educations and get married and keep populating. Pray for the government there, right? Be a part of the culture, be a part of the society, right? And, of course, like all good biblical texts, one can debate exactly what Jeremiah was talking about and the scope and extent of what he's going to, of what he actually meant. But for Hirsch, he is going to take this as proof positive that the spirit of Judaism has always been one of integrationism, right? Not of assimilation, right? Not to say that you should become like the Babylonians, but to say Jeremiah did not say, make sure to stay in your small enclaves and don't go out, and make sure to have nothing to do with the culture there, and make sure that your kids, stay at home so they're not affected by the public school system, right? Like, that's not what Jeremiah said. So here is back to Hirsch. He says, to be pushed back and limited upon the path of life is therefore not an essential condition of the Galut, Israel's exile state among the nations. But on the contrary, it is our duty to join ourselves as closely as possible to the state which receives us into its midst, to promote its welfare, and not to consider our well-being as in any way separate from that of the state to which we belong. So not only is Hirsch saying there isn't an inherent contradiction in wanting to be a ideal German citizen and participating in all that German society and political culture has to offer, Hirsch is actually saying it's an inherent part of Judaism to do so. In other words, he's taking this tension between Judaism and emancipation that everybody would have felt in the 1800s, and he's, opening up the Tanakh, right, the Bible, and he's saying, hey, this is actually not a tension at all, right? This is actually what we should be doing. We specifically should be trying to seek out integration into the wider culture. And he continues. He says, this close connection with all states is in no ways in contradiction to the spirit of Judaism. For the former independent state life of Israel was not even then the essence or purpose of our national existence, was only a means of fulfilling our spiritual existence. This is where Hirsch gets interesting. And I had mentioned last week, many today consider Hirsch to be a what you might call a proto-anti-Zionist. Why do I say a proto-anti-Zionist? It's a lot of, words before a term. Zionism is a political movement, and Sylvia, I'll take your question in 1 second. Zionism is a political movement, of course, would not arise for another 50 years. And so there was no political movement to reclaim a Jewish homeland that Hirsch was talking against. But many later on used some of Hirsch's framing of what Judaism is to say there's actually no room for Zionism here. We'll see that in the next paragraph. But Sylvia, go for it.
All right. So thank you, Rabbi. How interesting. My question is, I know we're talking about actual Zionism as opposed to not Zionism, but it sounds like we're also talking about assimilation as opposed to not assimilation.
Yeah, I think that's right. Meaning Hirsch, I guess we'll take a step back because assimilation means something different to everyone, and some people use it as a positive and some people use it as a negative. So Hirsch was in favor of some types of assimilation. So he certainly, and we'll see this later, he made a number of innovations in the traditionalist camp, which is why he's considered a neo-Orthodox, or what you might call modern Orthodox. I'll give a couple examples. It was a sign of being a Reform synagogue to give the sermon in German as opposed to Yiddish, right? Everybody knew in the 1850s in Germany, if you were a traditional Jew, you spoke Yiddish at synagogue, right? So you go to give the sermon at synagogue, or you give the drush, and if it's in German, you're Reform, and if it's in Yiddish, you are Orthodox, right? Same in America, right? If you talk about, Orthodox Jews didn't get to America until a little bit later, but if you spoke English, you were Reform, and if you spoke Yiddish, you were Orthodox. Hirsch, of course, says, well, there's no law in the Torah saying, thou shalt speak Yiddish, or, you shouldn't speak German. And so if more people can understand German, I mean, it seems, again, a little bit obvious. And this is somewhat connected to what Moses Mendelssohn's project was, right? Mendelssohn, as we saw 3 weeks ago, one of his big projects was translating the Torah into German, right? The first Jewish translation into German, because that was his same point. He said, and he's sort of getting at the problem from both sides, right? One, if a lot of Jews are already assimilating, then they probably don't know Yiddish, right? So your average Jew who maybe grew up in a less traditional household in Germany in 1870, let's pick a random year, the chance that they knew Yiddish was pretty low, right? I mean, we can, how many people in the American Jewish community speak fluent Hebrew, right? Probably a similar number spoke Yiddish in the 1870s. So Hirsch is going to say, well, if synagogues are only giving their sermons in Yiddish, right, that's basically saying, most Jews, have no place here. On the other hand, there's sort of a positive message here, which is to say, even for the traditionalists, there is a value in learning German, and by extension in America, there is a value in learning English, right? This again was a strong line, right? I mean, this seems again, it's one of those things that I always have to say. It seems obvious, yes, you're in America, speak English, but one of the major, say crises, say of the New York Hasidic schooling system right now is that there was a major New York Times article about this a couple of years ago where they failed to teach English in the New York school ultra-Orthodox system because, again, their first language is still considered to be Yiddish, right? So, and it's the same thing in places like, ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel, right? People's first language is Yiddish. And of course, Hebrew's a little bit easier because if you know the Torah and you know Rabbinic Hebrew, you can sort of pass in modern Hebrew. But there are still today, 15-year-olds in New York that grew up in America, full American citizens that have, a first grader knowledge of English because in some ultra Orthodox communities, it's still considered a value to not speak the sort of lingua franca of, wherever you are. So Hirsch, in his sort of integrationist message, is going to say, well, that makes no sense. And this, there's sort of many things that go down this path, right? Same with education, right? If the public school system and the university system says that all Americans, I don't know, should know Shakespeare, right? Let's give a modern American example, right? If that's considered, required reading and Great Gatsby in 1984 and, whatever else is on the high school curriculum, what Hirsch would say, and by extension, the sort of modern Orthodox camp of Joseph Soloveitchik, who took this over in America, should say, of course, Jews should read Shakespeare, right? We should be integrated into the, right? Now, reading Shakespeare doesn't mean you stop reading the Talmud, right? But of course, Jews should read both, right? The ultra-Orthodox sensibility would say, no, 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 of course Jews shouldn't read Shakespeare. So it's a little bit of a complicated question on what one means by assimilation. Of course, the ultra-Orthodox community is going to accuse Hirsch of being a pro-assimilationist. And the Reform community is going to say, well, he's just, Orthodoxy wearing different clothes, right? So you always sort of get stuck in the middle position here. But Hirsch's main point, at least here, was to say, there's nothing in Judaism that inherently contradicts the integration into a state. And then he says this, this is the interesting paragraph here when I was saying before about Zionism. And this is where a lot of people, get caught up on. He says, land and soil were never Israel's bond of union, but only the common task of the Torah. Therefore, it still forms a united body, though separated from a national soil. Nor does this unity lose its reality, though Israel accept everywhere the citizenship of the nations among where it is dispersed. The coherence of sympathy, this spiritual union, which may be designated by the Hebrew term Am and Goy, but not by the expression nation, unless we are able to separate from the term the concept of common territory and political power, is the only communal bond we possess or ever expect to possess, until the great day shall arrive when the Almighty shall see fit in his inscrutable wisdom to unite his scattered servants in one land, and the Torah shall be the guiding principle of a state, an exemplar of the meaning of divine revelation and the mission of humanity. So Hirsch is saying this very explicitly, right? When we say in Judaism that we are an Am, right, oftentimes translated as nation, he's saying that has nothing to do with a nation of political power or land or geography or anything of that. That is a spiritual bond, right? Jews have a spiritual national bond, not to be confused with modern nationalist movements. What does this allow Hirsch to do? So one of the great, denominators of all modern Jewish thinkers is separating out Judaism from other things, right? I gave this example many times before, but in the pre-modern period or the medieval period, Judaism was sort of everything. It was what we would call culture. It was what we would call politics. It was what we called morals. It was what we call, it was inseparable from just every aspect of life. One of the common denominators of all modern Jewish thought is separating out, okay, this thing is Judaism, but this other thing is not, right? So for Hirsch, engaging in the political process can't contradict with Judaism because for him, Judaism makes no claims over the political process, right? So you go to the ballot box to vote, right? Judaism doesn't, maybe there's Jewish ideas that would say, vote for this idea or don't vote for this idea. But if somebody says the voting is against Judaism or engaging in, American nationalism or German nationalism is against Judaism, Hirsch says, well, these are just two completely separate categories, right? Judaism, right, copying the language of Moses Mendelssohn and in some way Avraham Geiger. Judaism's a religion, right? What we would classify as a religion. A religion is a set of ideas and practices that make no claim of politics and other and cultural art forms and other things that you might appreciate in modernity. So this is what makes Hirsch, again, a modern Jewish thinker. He's not content with going the ultra-Orthodox route and just writing off modernity. He's essentially saying Jews have to welcome modernity because Judaism demands a welcome into modernity. One more slide, and then we can take some pause for questions. So just to give a little bit of a summary, sort of the legacy of Hirsch is what many call Neo-Orthodoxy. Again, other terms are modern Orthodoxy. And again, this was the project that essentially made German culture, and then by extension, French culture and American culture, kosher for a wide Orthodox audience, right? So dress, language, education, and again, I said this a million times, but this is what always separates these are the things that are going to continue to separate a modern Orthodox Jew from an ultra-Orthodox Jew, right? Dress, language, and education, right? Your average modern Orthodox Jew in America, they are fluent in English. They are dressed like an average, American, albeit maybe with a kippah and tzitzit. But, if you wear a polo shirt, right, a modern Orthodox Jew is going to wear a polo shirt. And jeans, a modern Orthodox Jew is going to wear jeans. And education, right, they're going to fully appreciate the best of American education, right? Not so with standard Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox. One of the other things that Hirsch, and this is sort of the last idea we'll talk about Hirsch, and then if we have time, we could talk a little bit about Zecharia's Frankel for the last 10 minutes. He was very against the idea that Judaism has a religious outlook, right? This is another interesting idea, right? His other magnum opus is a book called Chorev. Chorev is one of the names the Torah gives for Mount Sinai. And this is his, massive book, right? The 19 letters is very short. If you're looking to get a introduction to Hirsch, read the 19 letters. Chorev is, I think 600 or 700 pages. But at the same time, and just to understand this criticism, we have to dip a little bit back into the Reform movement here for a second. Many of the Reform leaders in the mid-1800s, because they defined Judaism as a set of ideas and beliefs, many of their debates were exactly what you would expect. Debates about exactly what are the contours of the religious ideas of Judaism, right? This is how you end up getting something like the Pittsburgh Platform in 1885. We talked about this last time. The Pittsburgh Platform, again, by the American Reform Movement, delineates exactly what the Reform Movement believes, exactly what it stands for, exactly what it rejects, right? It's an attempt to give the exact contours of the religion called Judaism. For Hirsch, this was antithetical to sort of the natural spirit of Judaism, where, of course, there are Jewish beliefs. I mean, Hirsch would say he believes in one God. He would believe the Torah was written by God, right? All the standard beliefs Hirsch would adopt. But for Hirsch, questions of exact contours of religiosity or religious spirit go a little bit beyond the scope of Judaism. Just to read a quote, he says, "The essence of Judaism is the harmonious life in accordance with the divine will. It seeks to sanctify man's entire life, not merely his inner convictions," right? So Hirsch was railing against this sort of internalization of Jewish ideas, right? Or the cerebral nature of Jewish ideas that many of the Reform Jews were advocating for, namely that Judaism is a set of beliefs and ideas about ethics and philosophy. Hirsch says, no, Judaism is about action just as much as about ideas, right? And this gets into sort of his main point, which I open with, which is for Hirsch, even with the fully welcoming in modernity, both politically, socially, and culturally, for him, Jewish law was still both binding and eternal, right? And, just a couple of direct quotes from him. He says, the law is not the work of man, not a product of evolving civilization. It is God's revelation. And so Hirsch was very, just kept putting his foot down on this question of he was not willing, or, he did not view it within the spirit of Judaism to budge on questions of halacha. Everything else, right, can be debated because that's outside the scope of Judaism, but halacha is the life force of Judaism, according to Hirsch, which is what, again, set him so fiercely in opposition to the Reform movement and Abraham Geiger, who were dealing with all of these other questions, but through an antinomian spirit. The last just interesting tidbit about Hirsch's life, then I'll pause for questions, is at this time, there was still not full separation of church and state. Still a lot of European countries, there's actually not the same separation of church and state as in America. And so you'll still have, say, chief rabbis in a lot of European countries still today. this ended up being a problem in Germany because say you're going to elect, the chief rabbi of Berlin, well, which denomination gets to choose that? And so the German government looked at the Reform and Orthodox Jews as they're all just Jews, right? And this is always sort of the funny part about, all these Jewish debates is, from the outsiders, it's just, we're all Jews, right? On the inside, it's these, fierce debates about philosophy and politics and law and religion and all these things. But Hirsch very much advocated to allow the Orthodox community to operate separately and fully autonomously from the Reformed Jewish community. And this is what ended up completely severing his relationship with Avraham Geiger because he made this sort of line in the sand saying, the Orthodox movement or the Neo-Orthodox movement, whatever he was calling his movement at the time, right? We are not going to have anything to do with, the Reformed community, right? So it's not only we reject, the practice and the outlooks of Reformed Jews, but, he advocated for these being seen by the German government as essentially two different religions, right? We can revisit that in the questions a little bit later. And this all goes into, again, his general anti-reform, right? So he has another quote, in the temple of the Lord, we should not play organ music, right? He was very against the bringing the organ into synagogue. If we consider the Talmud only as a historical document, we are not Jews, we are archaeologists, right? And there's many quotes of this vein where Hirsch, again, very against a lot of the reforms that were happening in the Jewish community. Take a few minutes to see any questions, and then I want to save 10 or so minutes for Zecharia Frankel. And if there are no questions, we can give Zecharia Frankel more time. Rhea, go for it.
Whoops. Okay. So sorry, but so you're talking about the representative of the Jewish community to the government or to the country. And so didn't that begin in the Muslim during the Ottoman Empire, and that the Jewish community, the people of the book, each one had a representative to the government, and that the colonial powers in Europe, that Great Britain in their colonial empire had representatives from the Jewish community as being the chief rabbi, and it still holds in England. They call the chief rabbi, who really represents just one of the divisions of the groups that exist, the Jewish groups that exist in England. So does that have any tie to the concept of colonialism, and you needed representatives?
Oh, interesting. So yes, it's interesting. So what? I guess we'll take a step back. Jews in the Islamic world, you're totally right. And this is back from the, 9th century, under what was called dhimmi status. Jews were, there was a certain set of laws that both offer Jews some protections and also place some limitations on what Jews in the Islamic community were allowed to do. But it was sort of a common theme throughout Jewish history that there was always the leader of the Jewish community was the sort of Jewish representative outwardly. This is a little bit different. This wasn't, all the Jews live in this one neighborhood in Berlin and you need to elect, okay, our community owes $10 million in taxes, but the government doesn't want to be bothered to like knock on everyone's door. So they just say, okay, Rhea, you're in charge, you self-govern, right? And then you would be the represented. This is a little bit different. This is just, general lack of separation of church and state. And I mean, there's similar questions today, say in Israel. I mean, some of, many rabbinic pulpits right now in Israel are funded by the government. And so it opens this question of, okay, well, what kind of rabbi, right? So one of the big questions that, involved it's involved actually many Supreme Court cases in the last couple of years. Can a reform rabbi in Israel, can their salary be paid for by public money the same way an Orthodox rabbi, right? So these were sort of similar questions, just almost in reverse, right? The German government, right, if they were going to, allow, the chief rabbi of Berlin or the chief rabbi of Germany or, the chief rabbi of England, right? Well, who gets to decide who that is, right? You're not going to make everybody happy. You elect an Orthodox rabbi, the Reform Jews aren't happy. You elect a Reform rabbi, the Orthodox Jews aren't happy, right? In some way in America, America, we sort of got off a little bit easier, which is one of the reasons why the American Jewish community is the way it is because there was this full separation. And so there was never really this need to like jostle for politics between the different denominations. There was obviously, other forms of jostling. But so I hope I got your question correctly. And even when the German community did elect, there was a man named, what was his name? Gabriel Rieser, who was a Jewish judge that was in Hamburg in the 1860s, and he was a big advocate for Jewish emancipation and everything like that. And he was considered more liberal than Hirsch would have wanted, and he would proclaim that he was speaking on behalf of the entire Jewish community. But the problem is, if some Jews disagreed with him, they would say, well, he doesn't stand for us. And so one of the things Hirsch was advocating for was for the German government to not see, okay, Daniel speaks for the entire Jewish community. Daniel speaks for the Reformed Jewish community, and the Orthodox Jewish community has a different representative. So again, just completely severing the ties of the two communities. And again, today in America, we don't even think twice about this, right? Obviously we know the Orthodox Union is different than the CCAR. So if the CCAR, the Reform Union, if they offer some statement about politics, everybody, knows, okay, that was not created by Orthodox Jews. But, this is at the time when these were all, jockeying for position. So it wasn't taken for granted that would be the case, that, there would be 15 different types of Jewish groups and they would all be different, offering different statements over politics. It was just assumed the Jewish community is doing this, the Jewish community is not doing this. So that was sort of one of his big things, is saying, no more is there one Jewish community, right? The other thing that's interesting to note about Avraham Geiger, and by extension sort of many of these modern Jewish thinkers, is they weren't thinking in denominational terms. In other words, today, even to become a rabbi and to, you join a synagogue, 9 times out of 10, you are picking a denomination, right? So, if you want to go to rabbinic school, or say you move to a new city and you're trying to find a synagogue, you might say, I am looking for a Reform synagogue, or I'm looking for an Orthodox synagogue, or I want to go to conservative rabbinic school, right? And so we sort of, have allowed denominational life to sort of, seep into Judaism, that we don't even think twice about it. All of these thinkers, Avraham Geiger is the case, Hirsch is the case, Mordechai Kaplan, who we'll talk about later on, he was the founder of Reconstructionist Judaism. They didn't say, I'm going to, come up with a new denomination of Judaism for the 20% of Jews who find this palatable. They fully wanted and expected all Jews to simply adopt their form of Judaism, right? There was a funny version of this in America, I think in the 1840s, when it was mostly Reformed Jews. And I think that this was Rabbi Weiss in America, but he attempted to come up with what he called Minhag America. And he wrote this, series of books and a prayer book, and he sort of declared that this is going to be, it was Isaac Mayer Weiss, I just looked it up. It was this prayer book and book of Jewish practice, and he published this, and he said, okay, for the rest of American Jewish history, this is just going to be the standard way that American Jews pray, right? It was sort of a Reform mixed with some English, and of course, maybe for a couple of years in some communities they use that, but general America, denominational life shone through, and nowadays even Reform Jews don't use Mayer Weiss's Minhag America book. So there was a lot of very interesting jockeying here, but it was a good question. Any other questions or thoughts?
Yeah, yes, Rabbi. On a kind of like on a street level, with the Reform Jews and the Orthodox Jews, how did they mix together? Were the two communities very separated, not just just socializing, or as they see themselves? Did they see themselves as like two separate groups? Was there like a real division among themselves? Were they socialized with each other?
Yeah, they definitely socialized. I mean, again, Hirsch and Geiger, did go to school together. They were friends. I mean, they were obviously living in the same cities as well. It wasn't until the 1870s that the government in Germany or Prussia actually allowed the Reform and Orthodox to completely split. I mean, in some way, it would have been a lot more like, like American Jewish life today. I mean, we don't think about it like this, but, again, I live right off of Michelson Street. And so within a 5-minute walk of where I'm sitting right now, I can go to Beth Jacob, Orthodox, or Shir Hamala reform. And one could ask, how much do the two communities overlap? When there's big events at the JCC and, big things happening that are anti-Semitic in city government, right? Community people will come together and they'll see each other and people know each other and, whatever. But, in the day-to-day normal life and on a normal Shabbat and for celebrations and weddings, the two communities tend to be separate and they're kind of doing their own thing. And it's like, some unity, some tension, just sort of the way that. And so it was the same thing, but oftentimes it was a little bit harsher because today we sort of just, grown into the expectation that, if you're an Orthodox Jew, you acknowledge, okay, there's going to be Reform Jews doing things you don't like. And if you're a Reform Jew, you're going to say, okay, there's going to be Orthodox Jews doing things I don't like. But back then, everybody was sort of vying. This was the first time this was happening. So there was definitely a little bit more tension, which again speaks to Geiger and Hirsch's following out. But yeah, there was very much, I mean, and again, the earliest Reform synagogue was in Hamburg, I think in 1820. But many synagogues were sort of coming up with some middle ground, which is why, again, I always sort of feel bad because I'm giving conservative Judaism the sort of least amount of treatment. But in some way, conservative Judaism, and this might be a good intro into Zechariah's Frankel, in some way, conservative Judaism was the most organic of all of these types. I don't necessarily mean the most, traditionally correct, right? That's sort of I think a relevant question, but it was the most organic because you could imagine you had Reform Jews who were coming up with these ideas of exactly what Judaism is with all of these reforms. And then you had other Jews like the Chatam Sofer and Rav Hirsch saying, no, Judaism needs to draw these hard lines in the sand when it, has to deal with Jewish law and halacha. And one could imagine a lot of people sort of a little bit in the middle there saying, okay, well, it seems like the Reform Jews are right about other things, but the general structure of Jewish law seems like it still makes sense and is still worth protecting. And so, there was eventually, as Reform and Orthodox became, so different that, obviously a huge area in the middle opens up, which, made way for what became, either historical positivism or later on what we know as conservative Judaism. It's the same thing in America, right? So the conservative movement was the largest movement for about, I think, 70 years. And that was because you had 2 million Jews from Eastern Europe between 1880 and 1920 come to America. They were not conservative when they were in Russia, but they got to America. And these were, very traditional Jews who mostly spoke Yiddish, who were not, they did not go through the Enlightenment and the Haskalah, right? They were in Eastern Europe, places like Russia and Ukraine. And they get to America and they walk down New York and they see very German Protestant-like Reform communities, and they say, well, no, thank you. And then they see very strict, halachically rigid Orthodox communities, and they say, no, thank you. And then, it just so happened that, okay, over the next 3 generations, conservative Judaism spread, super quickly because that was, a good palatable mix of halachic appearance that seems traditional with enough modernity to allow things to change and be malleable. So, Zechariah Frankel, just in the last couple of minutes here, one of the other planes of debate that we've been touching on in the past, but we didn't touch on much today, is this question of academic Jewish studies. We talked about this a lot last week with Avraham Geiger, and one of Geiger's main points of reform is that Judaism, just like any other system, evolves throughout history. This is something that Hirsch was very against. Hirsch was very against this idea that Judaism is a historical product. And Hirsch got into many debates with actually the conservative movement and Zechariah Frankel over the question of the Talmud, right? And, even just at the end of here, right, we see at the bottom here, if we consider the Talmud only as a historical document, we are not Jews, we are archaeologists, right? That was essentially a Hirsch's outlook towards, studying Judaism from a historical perspective. Zechariah Frankel is sort of, again, same time period, same place, right? Germany, mid-19th century. He is very uncomfortable with a lot of the reforms that the reform movement is making, but as a Jewish scholar, he observes that, according to him, it seems kind of obvious that Judaism does evolve throughout history, and he sort of rejects the idea of Hirsch that studying Jewish history is archaeological, right? So he's going to say, it's impossible to understand Judaism without the history. It doesn't mean Judaism's a fossil. It means that it's sort of this ever alive tradition, right? From Hirsch, and the reason why Hirsch called his magnum opus Chorev, which essentially is Sinai, sort of gets to his root philosophy that Judaism is a one-time phenomena that happens at Sinai, right? That's, the standard Orthodox outlook is that there isn't really evolution throughout Jewish history, right? That everything happened in Sinai, and the rest of Jewish history is maybe, different shades of that, or different people at different times discover different interpretations, but everything goes back to Sinai, right? There's a famous statement in the Talmud saying, all statements, any teaching that any rabbi ever gives, that was given to Moses at Sinai, right? So Zechariah Frankel is going to sort of reject that view, right? He's not going to reject Sinai, but he's going to reject that there's no such thing as historic innovation. And this, again, leads him to the centralizing philosophy of what would become conservative Judaism, which is, yes, we're going to keep Jewish law, because for him, just like for Hirsch, Jewish law was central to Jewish ideology, but Jewish law evolves, right? What is the Talmud, according to Frankel, but a evolution of Jewish law, right? We can't regard the law as unchangeable, but rather its essence, meaning the essence of the law is important, the fact that there is a halacha and there is a Jewish law that governs Jewish life, but any specific law, that is subject to evolution, right? So you get to things, and this will be the last thing I say, and then, happy to hang out for a couple of minutes after, right? So you pick up, say, the conservative movement's response, I think it was in the 1980s, but I'm sure Ramersha could correct me, over gay marriage. And you compare that with the Orthodox approach of gay marriage. And Orthodoxy, unsurprisingly, came out against gay marriage because you open up the Torah and the Talmud and, right, they conclude, well, halacha is against gay marriage, right? That is the Orthodox approach. The conservative approach, very much in line with what Frankel was advocating for, says it's important that there is a halacha, right? That there is a law, but the particulars of that law, that needs to evolve with the times. So there still is a whole set of law defining Jewish wedding and Jewish partnership and all of that, but that actually now needs to change to now include people, because, again, law is a product of history, and if history changes, law must change, right? Which is why, and this will actually be the last thing I say, his school is thought of, it's usually called the historical positivist school, right? And this comes from legal positivism. Legal positivism is a, type of legal philosophy that legal systems are sort of, operate according to internal rules and undergo internal rules of evolution. And so for him, Judaism was a historical positivist movement. In other words, the history of Judaism, according to Frankel, was the history of evolving and changing law, right? Jews always had an idea of halacha, which is why he was, again, also vehemently anti-reform, right? For him, the reform movement saying halacha is not central to Judaism, that was too far. But for him, law being central to Judaism doesn't mean rigid law being central to Judaism. It means the idea of law, but that law has to be malleable and adapt to change, and that's what's central to Judaism. And that, again, was, eventually became another, strict dividing line in the sand throughout the 1860s and 70s. Happy to take any and all questions. Next week, we are going into the 1900s. We are officially done with the 1800s here. And if there are no questions, then I will thank everybody for coming. We will be back next week with, again, early 1900s and, plenty of more fun Jewish movements to have happen there. I can give a brief, just, 2 minutes on what's happening next week. Next week, we're going to talk about Zionism, and Rabbi Marsha, I think, very wisely gave me an extra week to buffer just in case we end up wanting to discuss one of these topics for 2 weeks. That might end up being next week, because next week we put both Zionism and anti-Zionism in Jewish thought. I'll make the one disclaimer that I always give whenever talking about anti-Zionism in modern Jewish thought, that anti-Zionism in Judaism in 1910 means something very different than anti-Zionism in 2010. And we can discuss all the reasons to that next week. But as we were already able to see from Hirsch and Geiger and Mendelssohn and virtually every thinker that we've discussed so far, their entire project was based off of Judaism somehow integrating within the nationalist projects that were in Europe, right? So how do Jews become a part of German culture to get German political equality? Zionists obviously have a very different idea of what the Jewish future should hold, which is no, Jews need our own nationalist project, right? And you can obviously understand, many of the debates happening, and just to whet your appetite, the anti-Zionist approach, because I'm going to guess people are probably a little bit more familiar with Herzl than the anti-Zionists during Herzl's time. The anti-Zionists are not only going to say that, what Herzl was advocating for is not really Judaism, right? We already saw this really in Hirsch, but they pointed out, probably correctly, by the way, that the early Zionist movement is actually hurtful to their movement, right? If all of a sudden you have, crowds of Jews in France in 1910 saying, Jews are eventually, all we're doing here is trying to create our own state. And then you're saying, but Jews are fully French in every way possible, right? So the anti-Zionists are saying, you're actually detracting from our project. And so the fight within Judaism over Zionism versus anti-Zionism, again, this is all pre-Holocaust, pre-state, right? Post-Holocaust is a different story. But this is all pre-Holocaust when this was still a very valid debate, in my opinion, right? Post-Holocaust, I don't think the debate remains valid. Pre-Holocaust, it's a very valid debate because everybody who was involved in this debate was on team, we want Jews and Judaism to thrive. They just had different ideas of how to do it. The debates between Zionists and anti-Zionists was just as fierce, if not more fierce, than between Reform and Orthodox. So I will see you all next week, and excited to get into all that.